Afternoon. I want to make a couple of brief comments. Turn it over to the Senate's Budget Chair, Mark Leno, for a couple of brief comments, and we'd be glad to answer your questions. The economy is a stubborn beast. While we would all love this chapter of California history to be part of the past, our work obviously is not done. It is important to point out, as the governor did this morning, that over the last year we have reduced California's budget deficit, so-called structural deficit, from $19 billion to $8 billion. We have an independent revenue path now that does not require the unproductive negotiation and hostage-taking from the minority party. When it comes to the deficit itself, net of the November election, there is, of course, a balance between making necessary cuts, which we will do, and maintaining and preserving essential services for people, especially people most in need. The governor is doing a good job and has laid out a difficult proposal. We are not looking for a big public fight over the next month, but we will work assertively with the governor and the Assembly to find some alternatives to the most egregious cuts. Our eye must be on November. For as difficult as this gap is, we must win the election in November to end the deficit and maintain and preserve the public investment that is necessary for our economy to grow and for people to thrive. Senator Leno and my office will lay out an aggressive public hearing schedule, beginning with 11 scheduled budget subcommittees beginning Wednesday. Senator Leno?
Thank you, Senator Steinberg. Just to reiterate, we will have this budget passed, balanced through a transparent process by June 15th. That is a given. The governor pointed out this morning that the structural imbalance, difference from the deficit that we're dealing with, which has now been pegged at $16 billion, is at about $8 billion now, down from 19 or 20 just last year. So we have been making significant cuts. We've done this all in recent years with just the expenditure side of the budget, not the revenue side, of course, due to the fact that our hands are completely tied, that all matters revenue. And I think it's interesting to note that clearly revenue is the most important issue of the day. And because of the two-thirds threshold still remaining in this legislature, the minority party literally, not figuratively, literally controls all matters revenue because they can veto. 14 can veto what 26 want. So that's a bigger problem. But with regard to that $8 billion, it's a familiar figure. We keep bumping into it almost every other year. 6, 7, 8, you keep hearing that figure as structural deficit. That's the hole that Governor Schwarzenegger dug us into in 2003. We've never replaced that revenue yet when he rescinded the restoration of the vehicle license fee. If you go back even a little bit further to 1995, we can document that we have cut state taxes by about $13 billion. So we have a serious revenue problem. Our hope now is to prevail in November so we can begin to refill that revenue hole so that we can begin to reinvest in the infrastructure of California that taxpayers depend upon.
Glad to answer your questions.
Move the microphone so I could ask you this question about, you said the most egregious cuts, you want to work to find an alternative. What are the most egregious cuts? What's that list?
Well, the governor, I think, made some improvement in the CalWORKs proposal between January and today. But I think we are still very, very concerned about the impact on people and the correlation between grant reductions, between reducing eligibility and increased homelessness. I've tagged that one, consistently over the last couple weeks. But there are obviously others. Cal Grants. That's a significant hit for students trying to get to college and stay in college. Obviously, IHSS is a fragile program. There's a lot of it that even the mortgage settlement piece, obviously the impact on the courts that have already taken big hits. So look, in general, here.
Like everything.
Well, I get it. So here's the task. You give me an opportunity to kind of lay out a framework for how we go about trying to do this. You know where you have to get to, cut-wise. And so our work, and I described it as what I think and believe will be a collaborative effort with the Assembly and with the administration, will be to see if we can identify alternatives. And you're going to ask me now what those alternatives are. I have some in my head now, but over the next couple of weeks, we're going to explore. We're going to see how large of a pot of alternatives we can come up with, and then see if we can match, whatever we come up with buying down or buying out some of the cuts. That's the way that this works. Certainly, one thing, I'll give one little hint. You look at the size of the reserve. When you're trying to, you build up a reserve, should build up a reserve during good times. And during, the most difficult times, you don't want the resources sitting necessarily in the bank. You want to use it to mitigate the impact on people and the economy.
It's raining.
It's raining.
It's raining.
That rainy day fund, it is raining.
Senator, the issue of education, the trigger cuts, obviously outline another significant deep cut, not only to higher education, but to K through 12 education. Do you support those trigger cuts if the sales tax ballot issue?
I abhor those cuts, but that's the point is, look, the governor, I think, is a real straight shooter about all of it, and I hope we are as well. Very simply, what the triggers say, it's not a threat, it's not given the economic reality, that if the revenue measure doesn't pass in November, here is the result of not having those resources. Plain and simple. So no, I abhor the trigger cuts.
We heard in some of our budget committee hearings past months that there was something unjust about having 90% of the trigger cuts represented by cuts to education, whereas, of course, K through 12, K through 14 is about 40% of the budget, higher education another 10. The point that really highlights is that the governor has prioritized both education and public safety, and those are the two areas he wants to hold as much harmless as possible in the May revise. So because education is being held harmless, should the revenue not happen, there will be significant cuts represented in the triggers. On the other hand, the governor is proposing that the courts take a hit up front and be spared any trigger cuts should the measure not pass in November.
And I want to make sure that I'm not misinterpreted here, because it's easy to do so. When I say I abhor the trigger cuts, I want to be clear that I think that the governor's basic approach to how he constructs the trigger is the correct one. I hate the cuts. The only way to avert the cuts is to win the election in November.
Senator Steinberg, can you talk a little bit about the governor's proposal to reduce employee compensation by 5% and the 4-day work week facility?
I think that I've had some conversations not only with the governor but with some of the representatives of the public employees, and so long as it is done collaboratively again between the unions and the administration, something that was not done during the Schwarzenegger administration. I think so long as it's done in that way, that I'm confident they'll be able to come to a solution that we'll be able to support. And if that includes the 1038 as it's described, then or 1040 minus 2, then you know, I'm sure we'll have no trouble supporting that. But it needs to be done in a collaborative way with the people affected.
The cuts to the courts, I'm wondering what you think about that proposal. The Chief Justice obviously was here a month or so ago talking about the problems with, you know, that it's caused already, access to justice. This is more money gone. Is this something you would support?
Well, let me put it this way. Nothing is off the table, right? We don't sign pledges. I don't know how often we say that. We just don't. We fight for the outcome that we think is best, but we don't sign pledges. So nothing is off the table. And as I said earlier, we will endeavor over the next couple of weeks to see in a number of these categories if, and I don't want to raise expectations unduly, if there are ways to buy down or replace some of these cuts. That's what we're going to try to do, because the impact on the courts is very real. And I think the Chief Justice has been very clear and articulate in talking about the connection between those cuts and access to justice.
I just want to add that from the tone of the questions, I think it's interesting to note that you're appropriately recognizing the potential damage to the state and, of course, to so many Californians if these cuts are made, whether it's to CalWORKs or to child care or to IHSS or to the courts or education through the triggers. It would seem ever clearer that for anyone to argue that we can balance our budget and get ourselves out of an $8 billion chronic hole without restoring some revenue, I'll just say that allowing schools to contract out is not going to get us there. Every Californian needs to see we need some revenue, because otherwise everything is going to continually be at risk.
In other words, we are both trying to practice a modicum of stoicism.
Any qualms about taking the redevelopment money? Any qualms about that?
Qualms, that is a real cut to local government. And, you know, not that any of us are high and mighty here, but I'm authoring the bill. I'm authoring the bill that would appropriate that money, the affordable housing money, to local governments for housing. And so I don't like having to give up on that bill or on that priority. But what is the choice? Like several years ago when we negotiated the $42 billion budget and was forced to give up some of Proposition 63, the Mental Health Services Act. You know, we all wear different hats here. We wear our legislative hats where we are advocates for causes and things that we believe in, and we try to build. But then we are elected by our colleagues, or appointed and elected to be leaders, to be chairs of budget committees, and when we do so, we have to not set aside what we believe in, but we have to balance that with what our duty is. And our duty is to balance the budget. And I can tell you, as much as I hate that housing cut, I hate it less than the cut to the CalWORKs, because there are people living on basic subsistence that will then have less to live on. And again, I just go with the studies and the reports in the respected publications here, that increases homelessness, period.
Is that the number one cut that you want to avoid? Then you said it now a couple times. I just want to understand I'm not saying there's a full hierarchy here, but CalWORKs has been first and foremost the comment here.
I've expressed a hierarchy. I'll let Mark. I've expressed a hierarchy.
I think the finer point here is that in addition to the $800 million that the governor is proposing for cuts to CalWORKs, if we weren't to use the $1.4 billion of redevelopment funds to help resolve the budget problem, then we'd have to find $1.4 billion elsewhere. What if we were to cut CalWORKs by another billion on top of that? So the trade-off is, do we not build some thousands of affordable housing units over the next 10 years, or do we prevent another 100,000 Californians from becoming homeless who aren't now? And those are the choices.
It's like on the court issue, while I think we want to make a real effort to see if there's a way to, as I say, buy down some of the cuts on the trial court operations side. That's a different pot of money than the court construction side. And again, when you're talking about construction versus keeping people in their homes or with shelter over their heads, I think, choice is clear. I laid out, I think, my own basic value set, and I think it reflects my colleagues, which is you start with cuts that may be the difference between life and death, and cuts that will lead to increased homelessness, and you try to avoid those at all cost. And then after that, you make the best subjective judgment you can, try to spread it out as far and wide as you can.
Senator Steinberg said that getting the taxes passed would just stop the bleeding. Would it take us further? Is it going to resolve, you did say that the structural deficit, or are we counting on the economy also improving? Is it a combination of things that these taxes will really change the game here in Sacramento?
It's huge. And the trigger cuts reveal exactly what the impact of failing to pass the taxes are. Education does all right, quote, all right, under the governor's budget. It will not do all right. In fact, there would be terrible cuts to the schools if the revenue measure does not pass. But there's no question, I started out my comments by saying the economy is a stubborn beast. And while it is improving and unemployment is down, obviously, economic growth is going to have to pick up some, and it will. It's just a question of how fast.
Darrell, if education is going to do all right, before the vote, and most of the cuts are hitting the vulnerable, is there enough pain out there in the mainstream of California where this will convince voters in the fall to pass these things?
It's not as if schools are doing great, by the way. The school funding is not really kept up with the need. I mean, you look what's happening with class sizes, you look at what's happening with teacher layoffs, you look at what's happening to anything that is considered extracurricular in the schools. It's not that the schools are doing great. I maintain, I think the governor and speaker do as well, and our colleagues, that the public is beginning to feel the impact of what we've done over the last 5 years. Remember, this all started, I've been before you, similar circumstance since 2009. And you heard me say it many times. We started at $42 billion. Now the structural deficit is $8 billion. Okay. I wish we had the magic, the magic pill here. But we're denting. And we're now, hopefully this will be the end of it with the passage of the revenue and making some more difficult decisions this year.
It's a reasonable question. The alternative is to make these deep cuts to education up front. We prefer not to do that because that is extraordinary damage to an education system that need not be experienced should the revenue pass. But I would agree with Darrell that I think every parent sees the underfunding of our school system currently. It's no surprise to anyone that we rank at about 46 out of 50 states in per pupil funding. It's not a surprise to any parent that we rank actually 50 out of 50 states in the number of librarians, nurses, and counselors that we have in our schools. And of course, for the third of the population that does hope to and attend higher education, everyone is in that category is experiencing the increase in tuition fees and now the risk of Cal Grants and the dream and the hope of a college education getting further out of the hands of every middle class and working family.
So we've reached that plateau.
I think we'll probably know them better the day after election, but I'm hoping that I have the sense that this is a perfect storm for passing it. Everyone begins to realize we can't go much further down this path of, as our former governor used to so proudly say, starving the beast of government.
Anybody else?
Which former governor?
The initials are AS. Those are Arnold Schwarzenegger's words. I don't even try.
Are you going to go forward with funding high-speed rail, given, you know?
I speak for myself. You know, as we said, we're not going to do it we're not going to do it June 15th. But I continue to favor high-speed rail, even with its risks, because I think that the public sector has very few tools to improve the economy directly. And investing in public infrastructure will create tens of thousands of jobs. And it's money that over time we're going to spend on improving the state highway system or other less environmentally friendly ways of building infrastructure. And I think, you know, we had very good discussions last week with the Secretary of Transportation. I think that, you know, we want to push the federal administration, the Obama administration, you know, hey, in the second term, what's the next steps? Because we know that we're going to need more federal participation rather than less in order to see this thing through. There's only so much they can do this year with the Congress being what it is. But I think my colleagues want to know that there is a vision and a plan to get from Bakersfield to Palmdale and to build the connections. And that's what we're working with the administration on trying to do. Okay? Thank you, guys. Thank you.